Hey, did you know that the Phileas Club is financed entirely by its audience? It's true. People who wish to do so can go to patreon.com/the Phileas Club and pledge $1 or $2 to help us produce the show. If you enjoy the show, then maybe go check it out. Again, that's patreon.com/the Phileas Club. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Phileas Club. This is episode 95 for September 2017. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Phileas Club. This is a show where we get people from different countries, different cultures, different backgrounds, and we get together. We talk about the things that have been happening in the world and in our countries over the past month. My name is Patrick Beja, and today we are going to be talking about mostly European stuff because we have a bunch of Europeans on the show. We're going to be staying away from those crazy Americans and their crazy stories for, at least one episode. Before I introduce my guests, though, I would encourage you to go and check out the previous episode we did, which is about something happening in the Americas, but the Southern Hemisphere. We detailed the situation in Venezuela with Saul, who was born and raised in Venezuela, currently left the country, has been living in Colombia. And I'm sure many of you have heard that things are happening in Venezuela, and you're not quite exactly sure what is happening or what has led to this situation. Please go listen to that episode. I think it was not thanks to me, but thanks to Saul, a really good episode, and it really explained how things happen and how situations can go from bad to worse slowly if you're not careful about stuff. So, you can be careful and still not be able to change things. But so really, if you're interested in these kinds of things, I would encourage you to go check out that episode. It's number 94. It's called What the Hell is Happening in Venezuela? So anyway, we are here to talk about European matters and European stuff, and I hope that you will enjoy that too. As I said, my name is Patrick Beja. I'm from France, and today we have also from Europe, we have Matthias from Germany. How's it going, Matthias?
You know, when I look out of my window right now, I see only gray fog and rain, which perfectly describes the mood over here right now. But I'm so glad that you invited me to join you today so you can soften this hangover with stories from sunny Scotland and from beautiful France where everything is peachy right now.
Yeah,
right?
Yes, absolutely, of course.
Right.
And as you hinted at, we also have Bruce from Scotland on the show. How's it going, Bruce?
Hi, Patrick. I'm doing well, thanks. I just lifted the blind to look outside, and it's quite grey, but it's not raining at the moment. So that's
so
for
basically
once
summer for Scotland if it's not raining, right?
It is. We're all peachy here. Everything's going well. There's no political problems at all. So I don't think
sounds perfect. Let's end the show on this note.
Yes, all right. Let's. That's it. Thanks, everyone.
Let's all go have a beer. We can play some games.
Good idea.
I will. Okay. I don't want to talk about this very long, but I will mention something about our friends across the Atlantic. And I think it's a disease, a sickness that is gaining the entire world. And I think one of the issues that we're having is that we can't disagree a little. You know, we've all been hearing about that kneeling during the anthem for the NFL and the Trump pouring oil on the fire and all of this, basically this issue. And it made me realize I understand the social implications and all of this behind it and the meanings that all of this entails. But I really think that one of the issues we're having now is that when we disagree, and it's kind of becoming the same everywhere, but when we disagree as if our life was ending. You know, you can't think, well, I don't really think that's cool. Although maybe I think normal people think like that, but whenever you see anything, it's like any situation has to mean life or death, and it has to be the most outrageous outrage you've ever seen for anything, be it emails or tax returns or kneeling or anything that has to become a controversy. So I wanted to mention this because I'm failing to understand why the situations have become so dire everywhere. And I think this is part of it. The fact that outrage is always at 11. People don't have the perspective to think, well, this is not great, but I wouldn't go to war over it. It feels like everyone would go to war over everything. And sometimes I'm sure, outrage is warranted, but when it's always outrage at 11, then it feels like you can't even have any discussion about anything. So anyway, that was my 2 cents about that topic, and I'm sure we'll get back to it fairly soon. I did have a thought a few weeks ago. I thought we should establish like a grading, a scale of outrage, like to force people to realize how angry they should be about a specific thing. Like, a scale of outrage from 1 to 10, 10 being thermal nuclear war and 1 being like a mosquito that you have to swat. And you have to grade something that angers you on that scale to force people to realize that not everything is thermonuclear war, right? Like, even if you're very, very angry about people kneeling during an anthem, you're probably going to grade it like, I'm guessing, like 6, if you're being realistic. Like, it's never going to be thermonuclear war, right? It's not you have to send your children to die in Vietnam. That has to be more outrageous or frustrating or bad. So anyway, that just...
Yeah, but if you're talking about Trump, he's always trying to dial that up at 11. I mean, if we're talking about thermonuclear war, he's trying to get that over trigger. So we are at 11 already,
Well, so I think a lot of people realize that is not, that's Trump being Trump, even in his camp. And if we talk about other things, politicians often try to inflate the issues. I would agree that they try to do that more on the right than on the left, but on the left also. And that's the case in many countries. We have extremes, as we'll be talking about very soon. We have extremes in our countries as well. And they always try to make it seem like the issue they're talking about, like we had issues of gay marriage a few years ago in France, and all of a sudden, gay marriage was the worst thing anyone could think about for a certain portion of the fundamentalist right, which had never existed before. It was a small portion, but it still was a portion. And then they turned into anti-artificial insemination. I don't know if that's how you call it in English, but in vitro fertilization for lesbian couples. And it's currently not legal in France. And all of a sudden, they are saying that this is the end of the world if you start doing in vitro fertilization, when they never had a problem with it when it was for infertile heterosexual couples. And they're trumping it up. Like, when they talk about it, they're like, oh, and then you start choosing your children and it's not natural, and like a whole bunch of bullshit I'm not going to go into. But so anyway, I just wanted to point out that outrage is great, but maybe when you're always outraged about everything, you lose perspective. And I feel like one of the issues we have is that we're always outraged about everything.
I think that the effect you're looking at there is the slippery slope fallacy, where people will see something and think, well, this is the first step into oblivion. If gay people can get married, then what's next? We're going to be marrying dogs. It just seems to be something that happens. People will always look at the worst situation for what is relatively minor thing that doesn't affect them, and there's always this slippery slope into oblivion. That this is going to lead to, and it never does. It never does.
It doesn't.
It's just an instrument for the debate.
Yeah, yes. No, I agree. I will say something very controversial, though. I just throwing it out there, maybe that also, I mean, we're talking about leftist themes here, which I think are very important and I subscribe to. But I will also say, maybe, just maybe, it's not thermonuclear war if someone is a little racist. And I hope that is understood in the context of that, discussion. Yeah. Maybe we shouldn't go crazy if someone has old-fashioned ideas that are gonna, take time to fade away anyway, and they're not gonna all of a sudden, 50 years old, become someone different. We should point it out. We should say, I don't think this is cool. We should absolutely, not accept racism, but maybe not start a giant, demonstration and Twitter march because someone says at some point, I'm not super cool with gay people kissing in front of me. Yeah. And I disagree with that sentiment. My initial reaction would be, dude, you're homophobic. That's not okay. Just go back in your hole. What are you doing? But I'm wondering, seeing what's happening everywhere, I'm wondering if the cause for it isn't the always to 11 outrage, because we have become maybe so comfortable in our lives because we have everything we could wish for on our, pyramid of needs. Like we have shelter, we have food, we have everything. So the quote unquote, and again, please take this into the context, the quote unquote small things that it inconvenience us, which is not, people hanging gays for being gays. It's like saying, that makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to make a cake for a gay marriage. And I understand the social implications. I'm saying this is not cool and it shouldn't be allowed. But if we raise a political campaign around it, instead of letting time do its thing, we're stoking the flames, the looking at the situation. I'm wondering if this increased division that we're seeing isn't helped by our constant outrage. And if we want to achieve more, if the ultimate goal is to achieve our equality dreams, maybe we should let it go a little bit, Maybe we should think, all right, things are moving in the right direction everywhere, and someone who has been somewhat, homophobic because that's the way society has been for a long time, or a little bit racist because that's the way society has been for a long time, maybe say that's not cool and maybe let it slide a little bit, I don't know. I mean, I don't even know if this makes sense, but I can't understand why we're being so pitted against one another all the time about everything. And when I saw that kneeling thing in the US, I was like, I get the whole underlying issues, but if you manage to make kneeling into a country-breaking issue, maybe there's another problem then, Does it make sense or not?
Yeah, but that is a bad example because the kneeling is an instrument for Trump to enrage his followers and create an issue that is a non-issue. That's his method. And that's why it's a bad example in this case.
I think you're making a lot of sense, and maybe that's not the best example. Although part of me thinks maybe it is, because it isn't a big thing, but it's been blown into a massive thing for the wrong reason. But interesting what you're saying, Patrick, about people, letting things go. Coming from where I come from, I've got friends and family who, they are, and it sounds funny to say this, but they are a little bit racist and on very, different levels of the scale. And it's impossible for me to, I'm not going to write them out of my life completely because they have slightly different views. We've got to sort of work with them to change them. I can't get completely outraged every time they say something that, if they said that on national TV, they would probably get destroyed for life, never have a career in anything. So I think you're right. There is an outrage culture where somebody will say something and or do something, and what we need to do is say, hold on, we're all coming from different places, and it's almost like we're complicated beings. It's a strange thing, we can't all be black and white. There are shades of grey, and that works for race, that works for gender, it works for sexuality, it works for nationality, and I think the problem does come, and it does come with the kneeling thing, when people take extreme views. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. If you are overly extreme in your views, it's time to. If you have red lines that you refuse to cross, it's time to actually step back and think, well, examine them. Well, why am I like this? It may be they're justified, but I bet you find 99% of the time there's probably a little leeway at some point.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. I think you make a lot of sense with that, and it's interesting because I look at my friends and family, and I say I put up with them. There are people out there who are racist and homophobic in my life that I can't just say, well, I'm never going to speak to you again because you hold these views in this little area that might not be a little area, but it is in their lives.
Yeah. And I think we're not saying we should accept everything and we should let it slide and let it go, right? But I might have said maybe we should let it slide earlier. But there's a difference between saying, hey, that's not cool, and launching into a never-ending tirade of outrage. And I remember only a few years ago, a lot of people were using the word gay for lame in gaming culture. And that was in the 2000s. And progressively, that went away because people were saying, well, gay is kind of an offensive term, and maybe... Sorry, I'm nursing a cold, and it's not... entirely gone. I apologize. And we were saying, hey, maybe saying gay isn't cool. Not cool, bro. Just don't say that. But we wouldn't ban them from our friend list or accuse them on Twitter or and that doesn't happen anymore, right? We don't hear something gay, right? No,
but nowadays you hear terms like "this is retarded" or "you are a mongoloid" or stuff like that as an insult in gaming culture. So
we heard those before as well. I mean, retarded was a term before. It's just that gay specifically is not used anymore because, being homosexual has become more and more accepted. It's not perfect yet, but anyway, all right. We've talked about it. I didn't want to make this into a long discussion, but I think it's interesting, and I hope people understand everything I'm saying in that context. And I'm just wondering how is the best way to achieve what we all actually want to achieve. So anyway, all right. Let's talk about our actual local stories and things that have been happening in our countries. And I guess I'm going to start with what's been happening in France. And I mentioned last episode, or last regular episode, that we were going to have tax reform and labor laws reform that were going to happen in the month of September, and it was going to be a very interesting one because, first of all, President Macron has been falling in popularity at an incredible rate. He's very unpopular right now, or he has very low approval ratings. And the labor laws reforms are notoriously difficult to do in France. And everyone was wondering what was going to happen when he was going to try and implement those labor laws, reformed labor laws in Parliament. Because traditionally, again, what happens is that the unions and the left and far left parties descend in the streets, do demonstrations and sometimes entirely block the country. And famously in 95, I believe, we had the country entirely blocked for, I don't know, 3 weeks. Like it was impossible to drive in Paris because the streets were literally blocked, and I couldn't go to university back then from my home, which was maybe 30 minutes walk to the university. I had to walk. I couldn't take, the transportation wasn't working. Cars were everywhere because we didn't have public transportation. Thousands and tens of thousands of companies went under because they couldn't get their, merchandise and stuff like that. So we were really, and it happened again, not with the transportation thing, but in the 2000s. That is always a difficult thing. This time, it didn't really happen. We had a couple of demonstrations, one from the unions, one from the far right, again, I apologize, from the far left movement, the Insoumis. And they both had like demonstrations that they said were very successful, but the scale was not one to block the country or even block the city for even a day. And they didn't unite for some strange reasons, but the takeaway is that the government actually negotiated with the unions very heavily and got enough of them on board with the reforms. I'm not going to go into the details of the reforms, but they got enough of them on board to make those demonstrations not so powerful. So the labor laws have been enacted, and they're going to go into effect in the coming months. And so we had a significant labor laws reform, which was unexpected. And the next one on the docket is the tax laws that I did mention last time as well. So we have, as I said, a fortune tax where you get the income tax, of course, from when you get income. And then if you have over, I believe it's €1 million of net worth, you have to pay an additional tax every year on that net worth, which is a French-only tax. I think everyone in the world is looking at it and going, huh? And the interesting thing is that essentially the government has suppressed it, that fortune tax, which everyone in the country was agreeing that it was more symbolic than actually effective. And it was counter-effective because it meant some people would want to leave the country because of that. But they have suppressed it except for real estate. That still happens because I think they want people to not stick their money in real estate and rather invest it. And also they want real estate to be put to work kind of and rented out because we have a housing problem in Paris, especially. But the reaction I'm seeing from the far left is really interesting because they're being very hyperbolic, as they usually are. Basically, the way they're tweeting about it is, well, the real estate is still taxed, but the things like gold, how do you call them? Like not nuggets, but gold plates, gold in general, and yachts and things like that aren't taxed anymore. Is that the kind of country you want to live in? Is that the kind of world you want to live in? Like yachts aren't taxed and speed cars aren't taxed. And what's interesting is that they entirely fail to see that, of course, they are taxed via income tax. They're just not taxed a second time via the fortune tax anymore. But that does not enter their realm of consciousness at all. And this is specifically for the very active, militant far left, which is, in many regards, I compare it to the most active populist parties in Europe and even in the US, and they take very much issue to that. I think some of them might be listening to this show and think, don't compare us to this or that, but the activism that they have is a little bit scary. And I have only gotten, when I was discussing things in the elections, I've gotten these kinds of reactions from that side. Only a little bit from the far right, but from that side, like, people were very angry at me and like bombarding me with the kind of messages that you would expect from militant political activists. And thankfully, they represent probably just about 10% of the country, because they went so far on the left that even those that were a little bit sympathetic to their cause are thinking, wow, all right, maybe that's not for me. So for now, they're kind of isolated, and they've isolated themselves from the unions as well. But I don't know what's going to happen in the future, especially if Macron fails, which is not impossible. Yeah, so that's the climate in the country right now. There's distrust of the government, but at the same time, it's kind of, we know we need to do things to make things better. And we've tried a lot and nothing has worked. So we're going back to the center, kind of. And that little group on the left, which is vociferating very actively. And on the right, by the way, the Front National, which was rising in the election, is kind of disintegrating. Well, not disintegrating, but splitting. Because Marine Le Pen, with her disastrous first debate, has lost her all-encompassing power on the Front National, and part of the party has split into another party. So we have yet to see how it's going to play out in the future. It's possible the Front National will remain very strong, but it's looking like that party, the far right, is fractured now. And to me, it is because they didn't achieve the scores they were hoping for in the election, and that was disappointing to them, and so it created disillusionment within the party. So I'm still saying it was incredibly important to vote against the Front National in the election, which meant voting for Macron. And there was a huge debate of people who didn't want to vote for Macron because they thought he was too right-wing. So anyway, that's a different discussion. But yeah, so that's what's happening in France. And I'm not sure what to think of it. Yeah. So
the only way for Macron was downward, wasn't it? I mean, he was kind of the saint savior of France because he won against Le Pen. He prevented Le Pen from becoming president. And by comparison, now reality has hit. So the only way for him, for his opinion polls, were downward, weren't they?
I would say so, but the only way wasn't to go so far down. You know, I'm sure he couldn't maintain his high approval ratings, but he has been going very low. So I mean, I don't know if he could have done anything to prevent it, given that, as you said, reality has set in. But he, like a lot of people, are not happy. So yeah, Bruce, you wanted to talk about Macron, or?
No, you've sort of covered that. All we've really heard over here is that his approval ratings have gone down a lot, and it's kind of surprising. It seems like this whole, because he is kind of centrist, isn't he? Did I get that wrong?
No, that's the irony of it. That for the rest of the world, he's very much a centrist. You know, he's a social democrat. And if you listen to French media and French, political commentaries, the debate is not, is he social democrat, is he, you hear almost the same things that you hear about Trump's tax reform. You know, right. Like he's benefiting the rich. And it's true, his tax reforms are, in effect, going to benefit more the rich than the poor. But it's like, the state of the country was taxing the rich more than we were in other countries. And his argument, it's almost trickle-down economy, but not exactly. His argument is we need to keep the rich people in the country and we need to make them invest in the economy to make it more, more effective and more to make it work more. And everyone agrees that France has been lagging in growth because our economy is not functioning as well as the other European countries. And so we agree on that, on those symptoms. But then when you try to do what he's doing, which I'm honestly not 100% sure it's going to work, but I think it's something to try. You get compared, the reactions you get are, he's, giving presents to his rich friends. And he's a capitalistic pig. Which...
Yeah, it's very strange. It just feels like it feels like you can't do anything politically these days without getting some sort of, I don't know. You have to be a completely left-wing, liberal libtard or whatever for people to be looking at you and saying you're doing a good job. It's difficult to take a center line and to say, right, let's be sensible about this. I don't know if what Macron's doing is sensible or if it's just or something else. But it just seems a bit weird.
Yeah, I don't know either if it's going to work, but we've tried a lot. The left-wing people will say, no, we haven't tried everything. We haven't tried doing a real left-wing policy, but I'm not going to get into that. We could discuss this for hours, but
so talking about his approval ratings, one question: how did the people in France perceive his speech about the EU he held on Tuesday?
The media was very positive. I haven't personally seen the speech, but the media were very positive, which, by the way, leads to the far left. They've been peddling the idea that the media is all bought for and they are selling Macron because it's all a conspiracy, which, I kind of go... But so the speech itself was very well regarded. I think the reality is the silent majority is kind of looking at everything with cautious, not even optimism, but cautiously looking at everything. And there were a couple of missteps in the summer that people were not happy about, but it could be easily reverted. It's not like he's the devil incarnate now and no one likes him. If the economy takes off, it could change. So, but the speech itself was positive. All right, I really want to ask Matthias about the perception of Macron in Germany. Should we wait for your section to do that? Or
no, we can do that because, well, first of all, not a lot of people are talking about France right now for obvious reasons.
Right.
So that's the first one. But basically, France is going through some reforms and stuff we did about 15 or 20 years ago. So labor and social reforms we had back then. So it isn't really a surprise for us also because some of the politicians perceive France as negligent when it comes to finance and stuff like that. We are financially responsible. France isn't, So that's the sense some of the politicians, especially the conservative ones, have about France. So they are just waiting for some reforms that will change all of that. But basically, since we went through the same thing a few years back, it's not that special for us. We read about it and we hear about it and everything, but we just shrug it off like, yeah, well, we did the same.
The interesting thing is that we talk about Germany a lot, and the center and right wing say, well, look at Germany. They only have a very small amount of unemployment and their economy is soaring. We should be like them. And a lot of cheating. Well, exactly, because a lot of people then point out, to be fair, in every part of the political spectrum, everyone then points out, yeah, but I mean, they have a lot of poor workers. They have a lot of retirees that are struggling. And, so that is a huge problem. We're seeing the result of 15 years of liberalization in the European sense, meaning going to the right. And it, as you said, it's kind of cheating because you have a lot of poor people that are masquerading as we're kind of working, but not really. Is that something that is accurate, or?
Yeah, well, first of all, those reforms were actually enacted under a social democratic Green Party government. So even though they were going on the political spectrum towards the right or the liberal middle or whatever you want to call it, it was actually leftist government that enacted them. So there's that. And
so just to specify, in France, yes, Social Democrats are center right. For us,
okay.
For the rest of the world, it's center left, but for us, we consider them center right. Just a note.
Well, on paper, the Social Democrats over here are center left, but in reality, even since 1998, when the government who enacted those reforms came into power, you can actually say, well, they're center right or somewhere in the middle. They are no longer a really left party as they were. Enacted like 150 years ago, or how old the party is. But to this day, we still profit, quote unquote, from these reforms in terms of low unemployment numbers, because basically what they're doing is cheating when it comes to the numbers. So if you would actually do real numbers about unemployment, it would be higher. It wouldn't be as high as some of the other countries, of course, but still, the numbers are artificially kept down for the sake of appearance. So,
okay, I'll ask you when you get to you, because I want to ask you what you think of those policies as they relate to unemployment and the economy for the country. But maybe that's better discussed in the context of the elections. We'll talk about it in a little bit. All right, let's do a small detour through Scotland and what's happening there.
Oh, the joy.
That sounds enthusiastic.
It feels to me, and I'd be interested to hear if anyone has a comment on this, but it feels to me like the UK is just being pulled in about 1,000 different directions from everywhere. Up in Scotland here we have our own Scottish Parliament and Scottish government, which have limited powers. There's argument over how much actual power they have. They can do certain things. They have control over the NHS in Scotland, which is different from down in England and Wales. And they have various different things going. And of course, the SNP is still in power here, even though they lost quite a few seats in the last elections. They still have a lot, quite a hefty majority. And you would argue they're not doing too badly. It hurts me to say it, because when they first came in power, I thought it was going to be, quite bad, and my political views are quite different. But it seems like they're not doing too badly.
So the SNP, just to specify, they're the Scottish National Party. I just googled that.
Scottish National Party. Yeah,
and they're politically.
They're politically. This is the thing. They used to be. They used to be thought of as quite right-wing, as a nationalist party would be. But Nicola Sturgeon, who is their leader now, has recently come out and said she would change the name of the party if she could, because she doesn't feel like a nationalist party is what they are anymore. And I think there's some credit to that. I don't think down in England and Wales, she gets a lot of credit for what they're doing up here, I have to say. And this is, I voted very firmly against Scottish independence a couple of years ago. But that was before we knew about Brexit, obviously. But I would say they are that, they're right wing on some things and they're left on others. I wouldn't even call them centrist. They have some interesting things. I think there's a thing called simple things like baby boxes. I think it's something in Finland that happened. They've been trialing that out, and I would say that's quite a left wing policy, but that's something that's happened recently.
For those who don't know, the baby boxes are basically they're a box that every family gets when they get a baby, and in that box you have clothes and basically everything you need for your baby. The box even turns into a bed because there's a little mattress in it. And it was started, I believe, after the war by Finland as a way to reduce infant mortality, and it worked very, very well. And now it's sort of become an iconic thing. You even have commercial companies that sell baby boxes, like with Moomin characters and stuff like that. But it's something that other countries are emulating as well.
Yeah, that's something that's being rolled out here in Scotland and is quite popular. But then, they have other policies where they would want to, change tax rates one way or the other. In fact, they are going more left. They want to tax the richer people more, etc. So I guess that is a leftist, more left policy.
And they're anti-immigration, I suppose.
No, well, that's the thing.
Where are they right wing?
Scotland are, well, this is the thing. It's a very strange setup. As I'm talking now, I'm trying to think of something right wing, and the perception in my head has always been that they have right wing policies, but I think they've changed over the years. If you look now,
they used to be kind of racist, but now aren't, or
it's strange. The Scottish nationalism is, once you start looking into it, is less about race. In fact, when the Scottish independence vote happened back in 2014, it was very different from the Brexit vote, because in Scotland you were allowed to vote as long as you lived in Scotland. There was no checking of passports or where you were born or anything like that. Whereas Brexit vote, Europeans were not allowed to vote. If you weren't British born or a British citizen, you couldn't vote. Whereas Scottish independence was completely the opposite. I just arrived a couple of years before from Zimbabwe, and yes, I'm a British national, but I was, mostly English. And I was fully allowed to vote. There was no restriction whatsoever. The area I live in has got a lot of, it's got an army base and an RAF base, and all of the guys there were able to vote, even though they were all technically English. If you were to go down to it. So
you would be able to vote even if you were, like, let's say French or Chinese, or as long as you officially lived in Scotland, you would be allowed to vote?
As long as you had a residence in Scotland, you were allowed to vote.
Okay,
and
the Scottish,
weird. It is, and the way the SNP was selling it, and I respected it at the time. They were saying that, okay, because there was this thing about, well, what happens when Scotland gets independent? Who gets a Scottish passport if that happens? And what they said was, well, if you're living in the country on this date, which would have been, I think it was March 18th, 2017. Then you will get a Scottish passport. You'll be a Scottish citizen, and so that what they basically were doing is saying that we're resetting everything, and this is how we do it. We're not going to look into your history or whatever. If you're living and contributing to the country, then you will be Scottish. And even back then, I respected them doing that, and I think it was a very good thing to do, although it possibly lost them the vote at the time.
That's really interesting. It's such a different approach to nationalism, which you're right. Nationalism, you hear that word and you think basically Nazis and National Socialism, or like populism, but I'm failing to see any. I can see how it could become populist, or easy arguments, but it doesn't sound like something you have to entirely disagree with if you're, a humanist or.
Yeah, no, nothing like that. It was only when the Brexit vote happened that I really sat back and looked at what had happened in 2014 and thought, wow, it's a very different animal. Like I've mentioned before on Brexit, I've got a friend who lived in the UK for 10 years, paid taxes for 10 years, and just because he's got an Italian passport, as opposed to a British one, he wasn't allowed to vote.
Which I think that would seem like the sensible way of doing it to most people. It's you Scottish people that are weird by your tolerance and, openness.
Well, you see, this is the thing. And Scotland, I think, is it's a lot more tolerant than you would imagine. And we are very pro-immigration here. We recognize that some of the, I would call them dirtiest jobs, hardest jobs, they're people from other countries who are willing to work and do the work that will come over, and that's very much recognized up here in Scotland. So it's not something that they don't follow the nationalist, overly nationalist policies that you would expect. Of course, there are going to be people in the extremes, and there may even be responses to this where people will come out and say, well, there's certain things I may or may not have picked up on, but I'd be interested to debate them and see what happens. As far as the Brexit goes, that's this whole Scottish politics thing at the moment. Yes, we've got things pulling left, right, and the Scottish Conservatives and the Scottish Labour Party have their differences from the UK Conservatives and the UK Labour. It was very interesting that Theresa May decided to get into bed, as it were, with the DUP, which is it's a Irish very right-wing party.
Right.
Very, very right-wing.
Bart talked about this a few episodes ago. Briefly.
Yeah. So because they're right-wing, they're anti-gay marriage, anti-everything, whereas the Scottish Conservative leader here is an openly gay woman. So, it was a...
Wait, the SNP?
No, the Scottish Conservative leader, Ruth Davidson, she's openly gay. And I think there was a lot of tension amongst that. And she lost a lot of credibility here in Scotland when that happened, because she didn't come out and outright say, this is a bad thing. And then there's the Labour Party in the UK, which is... it feels very fractured too, and I think that's the only reason why Theresa May is still sitting in power at the moment, because you've got the Labour Party, which became basically centre right through the Tony Blair years. They're meant to be left, and they're getting pulled quite far left by what's his name, the leader of the Labour Party right now. Jeremy Corbyn.
Oh, Corbyn. I was going to say Corbyn, and I was afraid to sound like an idiot. And I should never be afraid to sound like an idiot. That's what I do best. Damn it. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, Jeremy Corbyn. He's trying to pull the party more left, and that's causing a lot of tension. But he has a lot of popular support amongst the people, amongst the younger crowd. And the only problem is at the moment. Yeah, go ahead.
So what's happening with the Brexit in Scotland?
Well,
are you like, what the hell are we going to do now? Like, damn it, we didn't vote for independence 2 years ago. We should have. What are you going to do?
I don't know. There's any talk of a second Scottish referendum kind of got slapped down, because where the Conservatives lost a lot in the rest of the UK in the recent elections, they gained a lot here in Scotland. And I think, I'm not a political analyst, but from what I've seen, it looks like the Scottish people didn't like Nicola Sturgeon a couple of months before the election was called, saying that she would like a second referendum. And I think people came out and voted against. They all voted Tory, unfortunately. Tory is Conservative. And they got a few seats here in Scotland, which helped them. So it kind of, I would say Scotland's split at the moment, and I would say it's a good 50-50 between people who still want independence and people who don't. And there's people who've flipped both ways. I know I would change my vote now if I had to. So Scotland, it's a difficult one. It's a very difficult one. They want to stay in the EU, but they don't want to stay in the UK.
Well, that seems like you would need independence for that.
Yes, and then there's all sorts of issues around how we would then have to apply to get into EU and how long that would take. So this was all back from 2014, and what currency would we use?
Well, the euro, we're very welcoming. Just it's fine.
Well,
it works.
I would have liked the lira, but
just abandon your older brother, like those silly British that wanted to. You didn't really want to leave. Like, how was the Brexit vote in Scotland?
Well, it was, I think, overwhelmingly in Scotland, Brexit, the people voted to stay.
Right. And so there you go. You didn't want to leave.
Exactly. It was 60-something% stay. Yeah.
Matthias, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if it does, how does the Catalonia situation we currently have in Spain affect Scottish independence, or the new thoughts about Scottish independence?
Well, the Scottish government, the SNP, are very well. Because they're in government. I call them the Scottish government. They are very pro the Catalonia. At least getting a vote, or being able to vote. I think, and personally, I think it would be quite bad if they weren't allowed to.
Usually the fear is if you start out by giving one region the option to vote for independence, everyone else will just follow. Like in France, the Basques, I don't know if they still want independence, and with the Scottish, and there are numerous other regions who want independence. So
that is, for me, it's the beginning of. Yeah. As much as I would be, it's different for Scotland because you are a different, it's more of a independent portion of the UK. I mean, it's hard to justify. It's just, I would say, it's different. And then someone could prove that it isn't in many ways. Yeah. But if you start giving regions from countries the authority to go independent, it's like, everything breaks down, right? You have portions of many countries that want to go independent.
Yeah, and you're exactly right there, and that's why I think it's all a nonsense. Actually, even with if Scotland were to leave, and if that were a better situation for them to be in the EU and for UK to split up, and there were all talks of the UK going federal, which would have been interesting a couple of years ago, but those don't seem to be spoken about anymore. There are situations where you think that I'm very much a globalist, and I agree with you. I think we need to come together more and stop relying on our protecting our differences. I think we need to celebrate them more, yes, but not.
I see what you mean.
You know what I'm saying there.
Yeah, I think there is. It makes a lot, especially in Europe. I mean, it for different regions, it makes a lot of sense to you can argue on the specifics, like which countries should be included, which shouldn't, which is where at what point does it dilute the strength of a union. But I think we need, even for economic reasons, we need a larger market, and the cultural aspect is important too. And the fact that we can travel easily has created in just 30, 40 years a sense of unity that has never existed before in the region. And if you want to prevent wars, which is, I think, something we all want, it's pretty clear that economic interdependency is a good idea to. But
well, a good example of that is, I don't know if you've heard about the whole Bombardier thing that's happening in the UK at the moment. That's kind of showing up. Bombardier are a maker of aeroplanes. They're a Northern Irish company. And they've recently been, with all of Brexit, the background is with Brexit happening, Theresa May and the Conservatives have been saying, well, we're going to be more of an outward-looking country. We're going to be looking to America as major trade partners and everything. And Bombardier, who are a Northern Irish company, which is part of the UK, have recently
they lost a contract with the US.
Yeah, they got slapped with a 220% tariff on one of their latest, I think it was the C, one of their latest products, the aeroplane. Boeing, there's basically a dispute with Boeing, etc. And previously, when a similar thing has happened, is the UK has eventually gone to the EU and said, look, America trying to strong arm us here. And the EU have said, right, okay, well, what we're going to do is, if America wants to do this, we are going to put tariffs on this and that and this and that. And eventually they back down. But now we don't have that strength anymore. We don't have that, the backing of the EU, the economic backing. The ultimate true reality is the UK is a small blip. It's not... economically, it's not this big powerhouse that it used to be in the years of the empire, etc.
Right. Well, it's a big blip in Europe, but on the world stage, obviously, if you don't have the EU backing you, and that's why it's so frustrating, those anti-EU talks, because it's very easy to see how EU takes away stuff from your local ecosystem. But no one ever points out the things that it brings. And that is a perfect example. The UK alone looks at Trump and says, President Trump, that's not cool. And he's like, yeah, well, deal with it. Whereas if they could go to Big Mama EU and say, hey, he's being mean to me, then Big Mama EU could look at Trump and say, that's not nice, Donald. And he would go like, but I really want to. And then she would wag her finger, and maybe they could come to an agreement.
Yeah, and I think as much as I'd love to blame Trump on this, it's not him. It's actually Boeing who are the ones who are pushing.
No, of course, I'm saying Trump as the president of the US,
but no, it's one of those things that you sort of think, well, this is silly, and I've eventually came around to thinking, well, let's give Brexit a chance, and. I'm yet to see a positive news story come out in any form on what's happening here. And I've challenged people on Twitter or on Facebook, on any sort of platform I've been on, so give me a positive story of how Brexit is going to, how it's going to improve us. And this is just a glaring example of how I think the British government over the past, since the Brexit vote, haven't been doing their job. They haven't been negotiating. They haven't been actually doing anything productive with making Brexit a positive thing. All they've been doing is saying, they call people who moan about remaining Remoaners, saying, oh, Remoaners need to be more positive. and we're sort of saying, oh, we're trying to be, but you're not giving us anything. And I'm a proud Remona. I want to stay in the EU. I want Europe to be a powerful place.
Unfortunately, I think unless something really drastic happens in the UK, that's, it's the principle of it. The EU can't say, all right, you can stay, because then it means anyone can have a referendum and say, we want to leave, and then it's not so bad. They have to stand on principle. And by the way, we're going to get to Germany in a second, but that also means, or that could have meant until that election, that France and Germany, which have always been the two very pro EU countries in the Germany-France, basically the UK has always been cock-blocking France and Germany for expanding stuff. So now it means both countries, if they want to, can actually do stuff and expand the EU, which is another reason for the EU to stand strong on the, Brexit means Brexit, goodbye. So Anyway.
And I think it's taken a few people by surprise that the EU are standing strong, and they're not taking crap from nobody, basically.
Yeah.
And one of those persons being surprised is Theresa May.
Yeah. They call her the Maybot. She just seems to have no personality. I don't know. I haven't disliked a leader as much as I've disliked her in a long time. So it's an interesting thing. But yeah, right. I think as far as the Brexit goes, there seems to be more and more of this Brexit effect I've been talking about, where and it's affecting everything in lives, where there's almost a justification now for people to have views, right-wing views, that they think are justified, racism or racist and homophobic. It goes back to what we were saying at the beginning. And there's a lot more...
What do you mean? How does the Brexit play into this?
I think it justifies... I think people feel like they've...
it's become more acceptable? Or?
It's been people... look, not everyone who voted for Brexit is a racist, and I think it's a very, very, very small minority of people who are, but I think that they've been given a voice. They've been justified in their views that Jean-Pierre needs to go home because he's not wanted here. He's a Frenchman. He's a froggy. He needs to go home because the Britain is for the British people.
And I'm sure it's not the French people who get the most of it. However,
no, I chose a very safe target.
Right. Yeah.
There were others I could have chosen, but I didn't want to. I think but so. It worries me. It worries me that to see this empowerment, and it's a worldwide thing. If you look at what's happening in America, and I know we don't want to talk about it a lot, but
well, we did already, and I think the argument you're giving here is something that people might have thought when we spoke about this in the beginning, and would have said, "Yeah, but if you don't denounce it, you normalize it."
Yeah.
And I think the argument we were putting forward is maybe if you denounce it too strongly, you elicit a strong reaction against it as well. It's like Vision says in Civil War in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He says, there are more superpowered people, and that calls for challenge, which breeds conflict and catastrophe. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's, anyway, we have to move on to Germany. But so last few words, Bruce?
I worry about the future, and just recently, just on the TV this morning, there's an NHS crisis which is happening across the UK, and that's quite close to my heart, and I worry about people, about the UK scaring away EU nationals who were helping people. They were helping the NHS prop itself up, and the current government is just not helping. They're not funding the right things, and it just feels like I don't know. We need a change in politics. I don't know what. I don't know how.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's the feeling of many people, and many people would agree on all sides of the spectrum. But no, also everyone would say, but I'm not sure what, which...
that's the problem, isn't it? So,
surely Matthias will say that everything is fine in Germany.
Of course, everything is fine. I don't know what gave you the idea that this wouldn't be fine. I mean...
So tell us what happened. What were the recent elections and what happened in them?
Yeah, I'll just start out with a quick explanation what we actually voted on, because unlike what some people might think, we didn't vote for Merkel to become chancellor last Sunday, at least not directly. As a parliamentary democracy, we voted on our national parliament called the Bundestag. So every eligible voter had 2 votes. The first vote is for a direct candidate for your voting district, the one you live in, which is considered the less important of the 2 votes. And the other one, the more important vote, is the party vote. So the result of the second vote leads to a proportional distribution of the seats within the parliament. And to get into parliament, a party must either cross a voting threshold of 5%, or they need at least 3 of the direct votes to get into parliament. And after the distribution of the seats is determined, you can calculate how many votes you need for a majority. And then the party with the most votes, which is usually either the Social Democrats or the Conservatives, initiate coalition talks with prospective partners. So basically, you look at how many votes you need for a majority, and then you choose which party you have the most in common with, or which might be the easiest to work with for you. And if you find someone to work with, you can then begin to form a government, starting with the election of the Chancellor by the Bundestag. So that's the vote.
Just a second, does it never happen that one party has the majority alone?
It never happened on a national level. And on a state level, there have been parties who got the majority on their own. For example, Bavaria was one of those countries who only was governed by one party for a very long time, one of the states. But on a national level, there never have been a one-party government. There always have been 2, or in the beginning, in the very first Bundestag, the one that was elected in 1949, I think there were 12 parties, and I don't know how many were in the government, but that doesn't really count because that was the first one with different electoral law and post-war and all that. But has always been a 2-party government on a national level. So that's the norm. So what was the outcome of this election? Merkel's CDU, the Conservative Party, is the one with the most votes, followed by the Social Democrats, the SPD. But both of these large parties, or as we call them, Volksparteien, lost a lot of the votes compared to the last election. And the party that managed to profit the most from this is the one everyone is talking about right now, the so-called Alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, and the short one is AfD. They managed to get into parliament this time and almost got 13% of the votes. The other smaller parties, meaning Liberals, the Green Party, and the Left, also got in, but they only got between 9 and 11% each. So you might ask, why is this such a big deal for us? Well, for 57 years, we managed to keep extreme right parties out of our national parliament. And now a party which is riddled with racists, fascists, and Nazis managed to get 13% and is now the 3rd strongest party in this country, which is kind of a big deal for us, given our history. And some people listening might object to this characterization of the AfD, but I don't really care, because if you're tribal, they are trying to label themselves as the right-wing conservative party. But if your leading party members are talking about shooting refugees at the border, if some of your candidates employ not only Nazi rhetoric, but similar orchestration in their public appearances, if members of your party want to put journalists against the wall and shoot them, if your party leader wants to dispose of German citizens in other countries, you are not a normal conservative party. And I don't care if you say that those are just isolated cases. They're not isolated. They're normal for this party and are part of their working method. And if a party tolerates and even promotes these people, I don't care if you're a democratic party on paper, you are a fascist one in reality. And with the history of this country, as this is not normal and never should be normal. But aside from this little fascist problem we have now, this election result makes it also very difficult to form a new government, because even though everyone is saying Angela Merkel won the election, she really didn't win the election. Well, yes, on paper, her party is again the one with the most votes, and therefore she will be again elected the chancellor. But the Conservatives, as well as the Social Democrats, lost a lot of votes compared to the last election, and she didn't get enough votes to easily form a new coalition.
So what percentage does her party have, and what percentage does the Social Democrats have?
So her party has 29% or 27%, so 27%, and the Social Democrats have 20%. There's a little special construct because the Conservative bloc is actually 2 parties. So if you count them together, they have 27 and 6 together. So it's little bit over 30%. But still, it's not
so
enough.
They're
to
missing
form
17% to form a government, right?
Right.
And do they have people they can ally with?
Yes, that's what I was getting to, because that's the part where it gets a little bit complicated for us, because Merkel's only options right now are either to continue the Grand Coalition, which would be a coalition between the Conservatives and the Social Democrats, and the same one we had twice in the last 12 years. But most people don't really like the Grand Coalition, and it seems as one of the contributing factors for the rise of the AfD. And besides, that's not really an option, because immediately after the results of the elections were public, a lot of the high-ranking SPD politicians stated that the party will not be part of a new government. Instead, they announced they would move over into the opposition and they won't be available for coalition talks. So this only leaves Merkel with one other option, the so-called Jamaica coalition, which would be a coalition between the Conservatives, the FDP, which are the Liberals, and the Green Party. And just to explain this Jamaica term, it's not that we want to emulate our Dutch neighbors and legalize weed. It's called Jamaica because these coalitions are usually nicknamed by the color, because every party is associated with a certain color. So, for example, the Conservatives are black, the Social Democrats are red, the Green Party is obviously green, and so on. And in this case, the colors involved are black, green, and yellow, which are the ones in the Jamaican flag.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you hear those terms, it's always because of the colors of the parties.
Not for the weed.
No, not for the weed, unfortunately, although that might help in the aftermath. But
So is it likely it's going to happen, or is it complicated?
It is complicated. Well, in theory, she doesn't even need a coalition. I mean, she could create a new government without any partner and could create a minority government. Sometimes this happens in the Scandinavian countries, that you have a government that is tolerated by other parties, and they just negotiate all the time on a case-to-case basis. But this is certainly not going to happen, because there has never been such a solution since 1949, and there never will be in the foreseeable future. And before she would create a minority government, Merkel would seek a new election. But new election is something that everyone wants to prevent, because everyone expects the AfD to get even more votes if we would hold a new election right now. So the only option is this Jamaica, and even if this Jamaica negotiations would work out, so let's assume it would work out, it still poses a huge challenge, because there are technically there are even four different, very contradictory interest groups that need to come to a consensus. So there might be a lot of issues that might not be satisfactorily addressed for some of the voters. And with so many people already up in arms about how the established parties, quote unquote, do not listen to them, the biggest challenge will be to openly and clearly communicate how the consensus is made. Otherwise, the results we just saw mean the rise of the radical parties, and the radical positions will even be worse in 4 years. But already the Liberals have stated that they are not going to roll over easily, so to speak. They will make demands, and if they are not met, they will just not be in any government. So that's the situation we have right now.
So, go ahead, Bruce.
I was just going to ask Matthias there, if there's in the UK, the UKIP, the fascist party's got Nigel Farage, who's the figurehead, and in France they've got Marine Le Pen. Sorry, and is there a figurehead in Germany who's sort of leading the fascist?
Not.
Party,
there is not one leader, but there are a few, like 3 or 4. Okay. And right after the election, they even started to break apart, because one of these leaders just announced that she would leave the party and will be in parliament without being as part of the AfD, but as an independent candidate.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's right now it's kind of a chaos, because this party has the problem that they don't have a lot of experienced politicians. Yeah. Most of them are new to politics or never have held any office. So nobody really knows what to expect from the new members of parliament from this party. But there is not one single head. There are a few that you regularly see, for example, on TV and in interviews, but there is not one leader.
So it's not like a populist movement that's being led by one person. It's a whole bunch of different people.
Right.
I find that interesting that somebody is able to get elected on a certain party ticket and then not sit in the seat in that party. I think in other countries there would have to be a by-election for that sort of thing.
No, if they have the vote, you can't take it away from them that easily.
Right. Okay.
So you are in parliament, but if you choose to leave the party, and by that the faction the party creates within the parliament, you don't have a lot of options to do your daily work, because most of the rights and the instruments you use on a day-to-day basis in parliament are tied to factions. So you need a certain number of people to have certain rights. For example, if you want to introduce a new law or a draft for a law, you need so and so many people supporting it. And usually that's just a faction that gives this your support. So if you are a single one, you can't do a single member of parliament, you can't do anything.
So she's basically going to have a lot of trouble doing anything.
Yes, but now she's talking about creating her own new party, and by that, and her own faction. But she needs, I think, 30 members or 32 members to join her to create that status. So now the question is, what will happen? Will the party, the AFD, split apart completely into two different new parties, or in the old party and the new party? Or no one really knows, because the Bundestag hasn't come together in the new constellation yet. They have 30 days after elections for the first
session.
Thank you. That's the word.
So
for the first session, yes.
You sounded a little bit emotional when you were describing the results. How has the country reacted? Because of course we have the ghost of World War II and the Nazi Party. I think it's difficult for people to understand how heavily this has influenced the mind of German people. It's kind of like what happened in Japan. It was both through education and cultural change and history remembrance that people in those countries violently rejected violence, kind of, and you have the most number of pacifists in Germany and in Japan now because of that history. And I think, looking at it from here, I think I understand even more why that happened. I think it's a consequence of the war, but maybe also a consequence of people having seen the rise of those parties and personalities, having been struck in horror by what happened, and then those who survived being violently anti those things. So I'm wondering how it was, how the country reacted on the day after. I'm sure it wasn't, fun, but what were the different reactions?
Everyone expected the AFD to get into parliament this time, so there was no doubt that they would get in. The only question was how many votes would they get in the end. And everyone was hoping, well, if they get below 10%, that's around the same amount that the small parties usually get. Well, it's not good, but, well, that's okay. We have to deal with that. But now they are the third strongest party. And if the SPD, the Social Democrats, would not go into opposition, but would become part of the government, the AFD would be the opposition leader, because they are the strongest party within the opposition. That's not really important on a day-to-day basis, aside from some of the rights you have and longer speaking time and stuff like that. But it is more of a symbolic position you get there. But the whole thing about the AFD is it's both kind of a rise of the right wing and also kind of a protest thing, because people that voted for the AFD are not just voting for them because of their program, but also because they wanted to protest the established party system and because they didn't feel like the other parties represented them anymore.
That's something I want to expand on for a little bit, because obviously everyone will have seen the similarities between that vote and the Brexit vote and the Trump vote. And to an extent, I think what happened in France as well, except our opposition vote was split between the far right and the far left, the people I talked about earlier. There's no doubt that they're not equivalent, but the people who were unhappy about the establishment, just some of them chose to vote for the Front National, and others chose to vote for Les Insoumis, that far left party. But both were contestatory, vote to contest the establishment. So that has happened in many countries already. I think what strikes me here is that, as we mentioned earlier, Germany has at least is always presented as a country that is successful economically. There is a very strong, a very low unemployment rate, and the economy is working, and it's the leader in the Eurozone, basically because of the size and the power of its economy. Germany gets to make decisions on many of the things that happen in the EU, and we'll touch on what that means for the EU in a little bit. But what strikes me is, maybe, in the UK, we could have said this is the issue. In the US, we would have said, well, this and that are the issue. And in France, we could have said, well, the economy and this are the issue. In Germany, what does it mean that even if in Germany, where things are quote unquote good, this happens as well? And again, context, it's only 13% of the Bundestag, which is less than in the other elections we've mentioned. But why is this movement rising in Germany as well? Is it not just the economy that's an issue? What's happening there?
Well, first of all, you're right. It's kind of the same picture we have seen in the US with the Trump supporters, or, for example, Le Pen in France, or in other European countries with the growing support of the right-wing parties, for example, Poland or Hungary. But,
and in Finland, we have them in Scotland, you just mentioned, Bruce, as well. It's happening everywhere.
Yeah, right. But the voters of the AfD are often like middle-aged, middle-class people. And from the outside, those are the ones that have a good life, so to speak. So, but for some reason, they feel left out, or are afraid of social decline, or feel like everybody else is getting something they don't. So basically, it's envy. And of course, there are all these foreigners, that come into this country, and they just want the free money while they are destroying our country with their weird religion and stuff. It doesn't really make sense for that. But whether or not it's actually true, that doesn't matter, neither for the AfD or their voters, because they don't really care about facts. They're just building on emotion.
Yeah. And that's exactly the same again. It's the same thing. But the economy is good in Germany.
Yes, and the part is, even if you have problems, and there are people who have problems, the social divide, as you say, is opening even wider. Yeah. But even if you are one of those people who are threatened by social decline, the AfD wouldn't be really your answer. There wouldn't be a solution, because apart from their loud rhetoric, they don't have much to offer, especially in the areas that concern these peoples. There are numerous policy areas where the party doesn't even have a concept, or if they have one, it will negatively affect the people who vote for them. For example, when it comes to taxes. But they don't seem to care. They still want to protest because they don't feel represented or heard by the quote-unquote traditional parties. So it's just to tie this off, I don't want to negate the racist, fascist, whatever you want to call it, problem we have in Germany. Because from the outside, everyone is saying, well, we recovered from National Socialism and stuff. And that's not really true. We have a lot of racists and fascists and Nazis running around here in the country. But and those people are the ones who are in the AfD and see their chance to get into power by using that party. But some of the voters are not interested in that specifically. They just want to make themselves heard. And for them, for some reason, this party is their outlet, even though it doesn't really make sense.
It's interesting, Matthias, when you're talking about the AFD, it sounds a lot like UKIP. Exactly what you were saying. It mirrors exactly what they were like. Lots of rhetoric, no real policies, and they had about 13% of the 2015 vote, and now they're collapsing. It's so maybe there's hope there. It may be that there needs to be a protest of this sort that kind of gets some sort of traction, and then people suddenly realize, hold on, going back to what Patrick's saying, we might be a bit racist, but we're not complete fascists. So let's not pin our hopes on that party anymore. I don't know. I'm trying to find a silver lining here, but I don't. From what I've seen in the UK is that this massive right-wing swing where people just vote for UKIP because they think it's a protest vote, and suddenly they realise, hold on, UKIP's anti-NHS. They want to privatise the NHS. That's not what we want, So I don't know. I'm hoping that it's a necessary evil, and it swings back for Germany.
I think I wonder if there isn't also a part of something that we mentioned on this show a good while ago, which is maybe this is instead of something more violent, like a revolution or people going down in the streets and rioting. I mean, the people you're talking about, Matthias, are middle-aged, middle-class people that wouldn't go down in the streets and start burning cars. But maybe the kind of frustration and outrage is expressed in that democratic way via a party that is basically a big middle finger to everyone else. And maybe that's the least bad thing we could hope for. I mean, we don't know. It might lead to something worse in 2, 5, 10 years, but maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, but if you think that voting for someone who wants to shoot women and children, who wants to put journalists against the wall, and who wants to dispose of people in other countries, if you think that is the viable form of protest, I have a problem with your protest, because I don't want that.
I agree, but I know
it's just the rhetoric they use, and it's the scandal they want to produce to get into media and stuff. I know that, but if you think that this method of getting that result is viable, that's for me. That's not acceptable for me.
But that's exactly what we were talking about with the Brexit and with Trump and with all of the extremist parties, in that outraged rhetoric that we have experienced for the past few years and maybe decade. Maybe, our reaction of, this is unacceptable, and if you think that shooting women and children is acceptable, then I have a problem with you, what you're saying now. I don't think that they actually think shooting women and children is acceptable. And I don't know what those party leaders said, but it's like Trump, or not exactly. It's maybe like Farage, or, those bombastic populist personalities who say things and they don't really mean them because they don't mean anything and they don't have policies. And the people who vote for them, yes, a small minority might say, yes, shoot the journalists, and actually think that you should, put the journalists against a wall and shoot them in the head for real. But I think those are a very small, crazy minority. Most of the people, it's kind of understood that you don't actually mean that. And if you vote for them, you don't actually think that's going to happen. And maybe everyone's wrong, and down the line, it leads to a totalitarian regime, and it's actually going to happen. But I do think, if I'm being 100% honest, I think that's not a realistic view of the world. And maybe your outrage that you're displaying now, Matthias, which I understand and I display often, maybe against our own desires, we're being part of the problem, because we shouldn't be shouting into the wind those things that antagonize those people. Maybe we should say, I don't know exactly what we should say, but something like, well, I think the people you're voting for are, don't have good policies and they're not good people. And your way of expressing your frustration is not the right one. But maybe there's another one that, that kind of more toned down. Because if you shout at someone, they're going to shout back, right? If you insult someone, they're going to insult you back. And I don't know where that line is, where if maybe when they actually start shooting people in the street, we might say, well, at that point, it's going to be too late. But maybe it's at that point that you should start claiming they want to shoot people, or they're shooting people in the street. Maybe it's not before. I don't know. I don't know.
I know that all of this isn't really what they mean, or maybe it isn't what they mean, because they use it, as I said, as a means to an end, to gain media attention and stuff like that. I know that. The problem I have with it is that if you support this party and get them into a position where they can actually have political power like they do now, you just normalize this kind of behavior. You give them the reward and tell them what you are doing yields results. And for me, it's kind of like Karl Popper described the paradox of tolerance. Unlimited tolerance must lead to a disappearance of tolerance. No, I don't want to tolerate that behavior, because in the end, if I tolerate that, well, it is just a small step to tolerate the next worst thing.
But how effective is that behavior? We've seen it happening in the UK. We've all screamed at it. We've seen it happening in the US. We've screamed at it. We've seen it happening in Europe. We've screamed at it. It's not working. Screaming at it is not working.
Not screaming at it, but it's not tolerating it, not working with those people. Don't give them the opportunity and stuff like that.
They're still getting votes. They're still being screamed at. But as a voter, being screamed at is not deterring them. Or, I mean, maybe it's deterring others, and they would be getting more if we weren't screaming. But I don't think that's the case. Screaming at them is not working.
Well, not screaming at them, but giving them an alternative to the alternative for Germany. Maybe, well, the other parties are were kind of in a panic mode and tried everything to get these voters from voting for the AfD and instead vote for them. So if you are classic SPD voter, they try to convince you, well, you always voted for Social Democrats, maybe you should vote again for Social Democrats and not vote for the AfD because of protest.
Yeah, but that's exactly what they don't want to do. That's the panic mode was everyone is shifting to the right and catering to these people by going more extreme on the refugee topic and other stuff. But that's not the solution, obviously. So why should I go further and cater to them even more? That's the argument that people are giving against Macron in France. They're saying you're going more to the right, and the left is going more to the right because essentially he co-opted the left and brought it to the center. So in effect, he's going to the right. And what people on the far left are saying, and I don't know, maybe they have a point, they're saying, well, the more we do this, the more it strengthens the far right. And it's an inevitable path that we're on, so we have to go back to more left, even though in France we had been more left than everyone else in Europe for a long time. And we still are, I think. But it's the same argument. Bruce, you wanted to say something? I'll go back to Matthias.
I was just going to say, Matthias, you're very you obviously know the political landscape, and you're clued up on politics and what each party stands for. Is how common is that in Germany? Is that something that somebody who's voting for the AFD, would they know exactly what they're standing for? Or would they just be voting for maybe a sound clip they heard here or something they heard there? These damn refugees. Yeah, I'm going to vote for the AFD because of these damn refugees, and they don't actually know about the issues of wanting to shoot people, etc., etc. Or do they fully know? I don't know. Is that something?
Well, I think they are aware of those sound bits, but I don't think the average voter on the street actually knows all the party programs or votes for a specific party. There are certain people who have special issues they want to see taken care of, so they vote for a certain party because of that. But I think for the most part, it's more an impulsive decision or a traditional decision. For example, if someone from the quote-unquote working class has always voted for the Social Democrats, they will now vote for the Social Democrats because that's the way we have always done it. Yeah. Or certain conservative states always vote for the CDU or the CSU, depending on which state you live. So I think most people who voted for the AFD didn't fully think through what this vote would imply. Yeah. But it's for them, it's the impulsive decision or the means to an end to show their protest.
But I think they would tell you, as they did for the Brexit and for the US election, well, politicians lie all the time. How is it different from these guys that we don't really trust to be saying the truth? I mean, we don't trust everything they're saying. It doesn't matter. And you wouldn't trust everything your party, your traditional acceptable party is saying anyway. So we don't believe that they're going to shoot journalists. That's just rhetoric, just like we're going to bring unemployment down and we're going to bring jobs to everyone and the taxes will be lower. And, that's bullshit as well. So
yes, it is. But for me, at least, I can say I just don't want to take the chance in this case.
Yeah,
for me personally, that's all the answer I can give you right now.
No, I agree.
We're not going to solve this whole thing here, of course, but that's just what my personal opinion. I know some of the people listening will disagree with me, and if there are voters who voted for the AFD, they might shout at me in the comments, and I'm perfectly fine with that. I just wanted to express the issue we have and why everyone is talking about this. And I know it's highly colored and all and polarizing, but that's just my opinion of this whole matter.
I think, Matthias, when you look at it, from what you're saying, the AFD are something you want to shout against, but it might be that the average person who voted for them is not somebody. I think what Patrick is saying is that there might be not somebody you want to shout at. It might be they don't know. They're voting for different reasons than that, and they might not see the Nazi issue as they might not even see the Nazi issue there. They might just think, well,
if they don't care about facts, what makes you think that my facts will actually convince them to change?
That's the exact issue we've had with Brexit, with Trump, and with many of the debates we've had in France. It's exactly like word for word the exact same problems. So I think ultimately one of the things we're missing in all of these debates is getting people to see the benefits of the system the way it currently is. Because it's so easy to complain about everything that people think everything is shit. But really, everything is so much better than it has ever been in every way. And people don't believe that. It's crazy. But that is, I think, something we could, with a little bit of a little bit of not education, but a little bit more considerate discussions show. And I think it would be the political personalities' role to show. Of course, if you look at things from one year to the next, you're only going to see the bad things. But if you look at things from 1 decade or 2 decades ago, usually things are better, and in many different areas, not in every area. Maybe there's less employment, maybe there's, but overall our systems, overarching systems, work. We have, if you look across decades, we have less illness, less infant mortality, more education, less poverty. Like, everything is better. And I think people either ignore it or don't see it or aren't told this. And the people come to places of frustration and complaints because they think that things are worse. And maybe for some people individually, they are. And certainly, I mean, not maybe, certainly for individual people, they are. But not in the sense that people who go vote for those opposition, FU parties believe. So maybe there's something there. I don't know how to actually make that happen.
You're right about that. But the actual issue is there are so many topics and issues we actually have to deal with, which are important and not for just now, but also for the future. And we're keeping up with this, sorry to say that, shit show we have with some nationalist bullshit. I'm sorry, but I don't know how to phrase that differently. I mean, we have so many social issues and healthcare, and I don't know what else.
Environmental.
We are stuck with this.
All right. So we're not going to solve it, obviously. I want to very quickly, before we close the show, I do want to ask how this affects the desires of European expansion and construction that Macron has been expressing. And is Merkel, I'm sorry, is Merkel going to be hampered by this new political landscape? Because I imagine the far right is not super happy with the idea of giving more power to the EU.
No, they're not. But again, they have 13%, so they're in no position to actually prevent her from doing anything. So that's a good point, a plus for this. But at first glance, since she still will be the next chancellor, some might think that this means continuity because all the foreign leaders know who they're dealing with and such, but that's a little bit too simple because this coalition I talked about, the Jamaica coalition, will be very complicated. The Liberals are not very fond of the idea of a deeper EU. They favor the multi-speed Europe, with that differentiates between the North core of fiscally disciplined, wealthy members, and then there's also the rest, So that's their idea of Europe. And the Green Party, on the other hand, completely rejects a division of Europe. So you have a very, very difficult situation to get to common ground. But in general, the topic of Europe and the EU wasn't even really present in most of the campaigns during the campaigning season. Aside from certain parties being against the EU, not much talking about that. Sure, some of the posters you saw said something about more Europe and such, but any of that really drowned in domestic topics, especially the refugee topic and the threat of the AfD. But coming back to Macron, so even if Macron held this rousing speech about a new and deeper Europe, there is not many concessions Merkel can actually give him if she's really in a coalition with the Liberals and the Green Party, even if she wanted to.
So that does affect things because the hope with the election of Macron was that he was very pro-Europe and Merkel was feeling the need to strengthen Europe and not just protect German pensioners, basically, because of the issues of Brexit and the anti-European sentiment. And that once she was confirmed in this election, she would have, her hands free to work with Macron to make things happen. But now it's not going to be the case, is what we've been hearing in France, and you're confirming it.
Yes, but there are two little glimmers of hope, so to speak. Number one, our current finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, has agreed to become the next president of the Bundestag, so he won't be part of the next government. And just if you want to know who he is, if you have ever seen one of those news reports about EU negotiations, he's the guy sitting in the wheelchair. So he has always been a very strong proponent of fiscal responsibility, not much spending and stuff like that. So maybe if he leaves, this might give some room for fiscal changes, depending on who gets to be his successor. But I wouldn't expect any miracles. That's number one. And number two, something you have to consider, we don't have a term limit in Germany, but this will be Merkel's last term as chancellor. That means that this will also be her legacy term. So it will be interesting to see what she wants to be remembered as. And it might just be that she wants to put her name on the EU in some way. I have no idea how she would manage that or if she really wants to, but it's a possibility, especially with issues like Brexit or the structural problems within the EU. So maybe there might be some change after all.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Yeah, well, we'll see if they manage to do something. Hopefully there is some infrastructure investments that happens. And I mean, yeah, I'm pro-Europe, so obviously I would be happy with stuff like that. One thing I did want to mention, another topic that was heavily discussed was the merger of Alstom and Siemens, where two giant industry, basically companies creating they make railroads and trains mostly in the context of Europe. And a lot of people in France were unhappy because basically Germany, Siemens retains control of the newly formed group. And that is frustrating for people in France because they're afraid that that will mean less good conditions for French workers down the line. But the argument for it is that it creates a giant European conglomerate that can stand up to the other giants in the sector. But I'm just wondering if you've heard about that or if you were too busy with the election, Matthias.
No, that wasn't in news. That's something now that the election is over and we're in kind of a limbo between the election and the first coalition talk. So now actually there are some other news. So this actually was reported on.
So was it like, yay, we got the French company, or was it we are going to work together?
I think it depends on which media you're reading. Some are very happy, but others don't care that much. I think, and especially if you talk to the average voter on the street or the average person on the street, that who doesn't really care? I mean,
right.
Yeah, that's just a merger of some industry.
All right. Okay, well, I think that is going to be it for our show. It was a lengthy one, but hopefully it was interesting. Thank you to both of you for being on. Before we get out of here, would you like to tell people where they can find you on the internet, maybe starting with Bruce?
I'm on Twitter, Bruce Woodward 3, @ obviously, and that's where you find me. And otherwise, you'll find me in the north of Scotland, wearing a parka, trying not to get wet. Yes.
Excellent. The link will be in the show notes, of course. Matthias, what about you?
I've been a bit of social media diet for the last few weeks because of the election, since it's better for my blood pressure if I don't read the petty bickering of politicians. But since the election is now over, I slowly return. And if you want to talk to me, you can find me on Twitter. My handle is @Matzekult, and it will also be in the show notes. So.
Yeah. Absolutely. I am not Patrick on Twitter, and you can find this show, and on Facebook as well. And you can find this show at FrenchSpin.com, which is the site where I host my English language productions. You can find the French ones at FrenchSpin.fr. You can also leave a review on iTunes if you want to do so. It would be very helpful, obviously, wherever you live. Just go to iTunes and give us a 5-star reviews. That would be awesome. And even more awesome, you could financially contribute to the show. You could go to patreon.com/the Phileas Club. A bunch of people there actually support the show, and I am eternally grateful. If you think this brings you something, if that makes you think a little bit, if you think we're doing it the right way, unlike many others that are doing it the wrong way, then maybe think of going to patreon.com/the Phileas Club and sending a couple of bucks our way. This is obviously available on the show notes as well. And again, I would like to remind you to go listen to the episode about Venezuela if you haven't. It really is a good one, I think. So thank you for listening, and we will be back very shortly. Bye.